I think AI is going to be a tool. It's going to be like Excel. It's going to be woven into the fabric of things that we do. And I do think a lot of change is coming, but also I think what you're seeing right now is a very short term reaction when nobody knows anything, right? I think long term for people of your generation, this is going to be a tool that you're going to shape and use. So I don't believe that, you are going to be used by AI. You are going to use AI.
That's how my guest sums up the next 10 years. Not the apocalypse, not the singularity, just a tool. Like a spreadsheet, woven into the fabric of how we work. Dr. Sumitra Ganesh runs AI research at JP Morgan. She built her first machine learning classifier at Berkeley before the school taught a single course on it. Today, her group simulates whole markets, publishes at NeurIPS, open sources the tools the rest of the field uses, and helps decide where AI shows up next inside one of the largest banks in the world.
And so I still remember this was one of the big aha moments when we started to see this behavior, because this is exactly how trading desks manage their inventory, market makers manage their inventory. And that was something that emerged automatically, and it led to a lot of the follow-on work as well.
On this episode, why she'd still call it augmentation, not automation. The one open problem, she says, if you solved it tomorrow, would change everything about finance. Why she still thinks small models are the most underhyped idea in AI right now. And the advice she'd give a 16-year-old that has nothing to do with AI. I'm Satvik Subramanian, founder of Wizen AI. This is AI Innovators High School Edition. Let's get into it. Welcome to the show. I've been preparing this for weeks, so to start, and I always start here, can you tell me how you made your way into the world of AI?
I guess my bachelor's was actually in electrical engineering and communications. So when I came to Berkeley, my objective for my PhD was actually to do a PhD in communications at that time. But then I started working with this group for my master's, where I built a system that could classify magnetic signatures of different vehicles using support vector machines. And that was my first exposure to the world of machine learning and AI. I'd never taken an AI or machine learning course before that, but I kind of learned it on the go on that project, reading papers, and I loved it. So I still remember the first classifier I built, and I really got a kick out of it. So that's when I made the switch. I wanted to work more on this than communications, and so I switched.
I want to specifically focus on the PhD thesis that you did. It was on recognizing goal-directed human actions from 3D visual data. So basically teaching a computer to figure out what a person was trying to do just by watching them move. So when I read that, I thought that it's not really a finance paper. So I have to ask, what was the through line in your head from inverse learning on human motion to multi-agent reinforcement learning on financial markets?
At that time, none, to be honest. So that connection came much later. So when I was working on my thesis, at that time when people were, you have to remember, you have to contextualize. I finished my PhD in 2009. So this was before AlexNet, before the neural network kind of revolution that came in 2020. So when I took my graduate courses at Berkeley, there was not a single course, in fact, not a single lecture on neural networks. So it was a different time. But at that time, people were looking at classifying different types of human actions by looking at the 3D, or rather the 4D trajectories, the spatiotemporal trajectories, and finding different subspaces so they could classify. But my approach, or my idea when I started looking at the problem, was to focus on what is the objective of the action. And I did quite a bit of study at that time, and I took courses in computational neuroscience as well. And the studies showed that even if you're achieving the same objective, like say picking up a glass of water, you might use very different trajectories at different times. So what is really common is the objective. And so the work I did was, given a set of trajectories, how can you actually infer the latent objective that you're trying to optimize and classify the trajectories based on that. Now, immediately there wasn't a link, though actually at that time, and it was one of the reasons I got interested in finance at that time, is several of the papers that I was reading at that time also had applications in finance, because you have a similar kind of problem of wanting to infer the latent states of some dynamical system from, for instance, market data. So that's what got me interested, but there wasn't a direct link at that time. But interestingly, as you mentioned, like when I started working on multi-agent systems and RL, which was almost like 8, 9 years later in my career, there was a connection, because when I started thinking about agents in a multi-agent system, I was thinking similarly about characterizing these agents not by specifying what types of actions they would take in different settings, but by characterizing what the incentives are for different agents, and that the actions kind of automatically arise from those incentives.
Nice. And going from that into the research you actually did, 8 to 9 years later, or even after that, in 2019, you and your team published this paper called Reinforcement Learning for Market Making in a Multi-Agent Dealer Market. For people listening, a market maker is the firm that's always willing to buy or sell, and they make money on the spread. And so your paper specifically showed that an RL agent could learn its competitor's pricing policy and manage inventory by choosing asymmetric buy and sell prices. So can you walk us through what exactly surprised you most when you first saw those results?
Yeah, like this was one of the first when I joined AI research, which was like a newly formed team at that time. So we were barely 10 people. When we started working on this, one of the ideas we had in our mind was that we want to be able to only specify what the reward functions are for different agents, and then have the behaviors emerge from that, right? So, but when we started, frankly, we did not know how far we would get in. And the joke amongst us used to be, if we can train an agent to automatically buy low and sell high, like that would be a win. So it was for us, like when the way we would do it is like we would train these different agents, essentially playing against themselves, against each other, in different market makers and liquidity takers playing against each other in simulation. And then we would do checkpoints and analyze the behaviors that are emerging. And so this was I still remember this was one of the big aha moments when we started to see this behavior, because this is exactly how trading desks manage their inventory, market makers manage their inventory. So it's like any shop, if you have too much inventory of something, like what do? Right? You give a discount and then you hope that the inventory starts to move, or the other way around. If you want to build up inventory, you price accordingly. And that was something that emerged automatically. It's not something we kind of handcrafted or hard coded, and it emerged naturally. And that gave us a lot of confidence in this thesis of building complex multi-agent simulations for markets with this very minimal specification of reward functions and preferences, and the connectivity network as well between the agents in this case. So it gave us a lot of confidence in sort of like the base hypothesis we were working on, and it led to a lot of the follow-on work as well.
Yeah, and then obviously the follow-on work, right? Moving forward a couple of years later, the group released something a little different, Phantom, open source on GitHub, and it was an entire framework for multi-agent reinforcement learning simulations. And the part that jumped out to me is that Phantom is explicitly not just for finance. Your paper showcases it on a digital advertising market and on a supply chain operational problem. And so the question I want to ask is two-part. First, what is Phantom actually doing that you couldn't do before? And so like what is like the real technical leap? And second would be, why generalize beyond markets? Why why was a supply chain even on the menu for a JP Morgan AI research project?
Yeah. So at that time, so our motivation for releasing Phantom, as I said, we were doing all this work around RL-based training of multi-agent simulations. And RL-based training itself was actually a shift, because Before that, most of you had this field called agent-based modeling, which is a field that sits at the intersection of computer science and economics, or computational economics. And in that field, largely people would do agent-based simulations based on some very simple behaviors that would be heuristic behaviors that were coded up. And and then you run the simulations and you observe what kind of behaviors emerge from that. So doing RL-based simulations itself was a shift from what people were doing earlier in terms of agent-based modeling. But with Phantom, one of the things we wanted to do is really get the community thinking about a different set of problems that were more relevant to finance. Because at that time, the biggest RL benchmarks that people were working on were primarily around games or around robotics. So you have this very famous benchmark, still famous, like called Mujoko, which is around robotics. And the the other set of benchmarks were really around games, so Atari games and other kinds of even multiplayer games. But we felt there was a big difference between these environments and the types of problems that we were interested in. And so that was part of the motivation to release Phantom. Is, first of all, it actually builds on open source libraries for distributed multi-agent RL from Berkeley. So it builds on top of that. But it really lays out formulation for people to quickly specify different types of economic environments and problems to study. And we released a few different environments, as you said, like supply chain. And that was partly to kind of put a stake in the ground to say, hey, there are economically important problems, which is not, some multiplayer video game that has interesting characteristics that as a research community we should be working on. So it was kind of selfishly motivated by wanting to steer the research community or give the research community other environments besides, video games to work on.
Hmm. And I think in 2021 you published Towards a Fully RL-based Market Simulator, where liquidity providers and takers both learn at the same time. When two AI agents are learning against each other in the same simulation, how do you know that the behaviors that you're seeing are actually like realistic? How do you know that they're not just two algorithms gaming each other in a way that wouldn't ever happen in the real world?
Yeah, so this is the biggest challenge actually for multi-agent simulations, RL based or otherwise, is how do you know it is realistic? So, and in fact, our first paper at NeurIPS in 2020 was on this, which is how do you automatically train, actually using a bi-level RL system? How do you automatically calibrate a simulation to real data? Because what you're right, like how you can have the hard part in multi-agent RL is that your solution really depends on the mix of agents that you have in the system. So if you look at it from the perspective of one agent, if you're doing single agent RL, your environment is largely fixed, right? And you say, okay, what is the optimal way this agent can play this Atari game? But the Atari game itself is fixed. But multi-agent RL is like so many moving pieces because your game actually depends on how the other players are playing and who these other players are. And so you have the way you make it realistic is to actually calibrate that population of players and their reward functions or some characteristics of their reward functions in a way that matches certain aspects of real data, right? So if every market has some mix of different types of players who have different, for instance, risk appetites in terms of what they're willing to do, how much risk they're willing to take on. But you have to calibrate that mix in a way that the outcomes you're seeing from that simulated market match certain characteristics or the distributional characteristics of the real market that you can observe. So you're not creating a simulation, as you said, which might be feasible, but is not realistic, does not simulate a real market. So typically what we do is we actually calibrate the whole thing to data from a specific market.
Okay. And I think
And you can
Your-
ask questions also, by the way.
yeah, I mean, your paper in 2022 did extend this framework to over-the-counter markets and showed that shared policy learning with a parameterized reward could solve this problem. So now looking at like all the papers that you've shipped, right? What is your favorite paper? Like which one do you feel the most proud of?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think the first one always will hold our first NeurIPS paper will always hold a special place in my heart, just because I think even as a group, it was the first time we cracked NeurIPS, and so that was a pretty big deal for a new research group, and so that was always special. And also, I think from a methodology standpoint, it is something we still use today, which is the things that you mentioned, right? Like having a shared policy network so you can train efficiently across many different agents, having this kind of bi-level framework. And we have several papers even this year on bi-level optimization, but really the journey started there. So in some sense, that paper is very close to my heart because it kind of it set the group up for success.
Yeah, NeurIPS is it's really big and it's probably really significant. But anyways, I moving on to where the research is now, which is generative agents in finance. Last May, you and your collaborators published Generative AI Agents for Knowledge Work Augmentation in Finance in annual reviews. And so let's start at the foundation. When you say AI agent, obviously you mean something more than a chatbot. So can you define it the way you would define it on a whiteboard to someone completely new to it?
Yeah, sure. So I think the concept of an agent has existed in AI for a very long time. So it's not a new concept. It has become a very popular term recently, but you know, all the work we did in reinforcement learning, those were agents. So agent is a term that goes back to the 1980s, and there's been a lot of work in AI over the years. So let me first define what an agent is, but I'll tell you, like at that time when we wrote that paper, part of it was that even for people like us who had been in the field for a while and working with agents, I think with LLMs coming onto the scene, we had to kind of map what we knew about agents to what this new world was. And how do we think about it's almost like how do we think about the space of agents now? And I can tell you there was a lot of kind of debate and discussion that went into even framing that, even though it was kind of the meeting of the old and the new in that paper and our thinking around it. So agents, if you ask like how would I define it on a whiteboard to people, you know, literally every oral presentation starts with this. I don't know if you've seen it, Satvik, but it starts with this picture of an agent and the environment, the rest of the world. And even the most famous researchers in oral, I've seen like the first slide is always like one slide which shows this. So the an agent is defined as an AI system that takes in observations from the world and then it has some goal it is trying to optimize, it is trying to reach. And so, based on that, it decides what is the next action it should take or next set of actions it should take. And then it takes those actions, it executes those actions, which changes the state of the world. So, that goes back into the environment and changes the state of the environment. And the environment might come back again with more observations and some kind of feedback or reward, which helps the agent with its learning or with evaluating whether it is achieving its objective or goal. So that's kind of the definition of an agent. And it's one of these very broad things that can accommodate many different types of actually AI methodologies, because you're not saying how the agent really goes from observations to actions. All you're saying is an agent is some system that takes in observations, has some objective, and somehow decides what is the next hopefully best action to take. So it gives a lot of room for accommodating actually different types of methodologies, including reinforcement learning, classical AI planning. There've always been a host of techniques. And then when LLMs came along, now you have another set of methods to actually go from observations to actions. And in between, one of the ways you do that is through planning and reasoning and what people call tool polling and all of these things.
Thank you for that definition. I mean, it does definitely like make sense, I guess. It's a more clear definition. And talking more about the paper specifically, I want to focus on that phrase, knowledge work augmentation, and the choice of the word augmentation instead of automation. I just wanted to ask about that choice. Why why did your group frame it that way exactly?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I was just thinking, like, a year is a long time in this field right now. But I think even if I were to write that today, I would still call it augmentation, in the sense that I think for a lot of, especially in the context of, actual complex, nuanced work in domains like finance, I think there is still a fair amount of gap between the kind of judgment and nuance that humans use, and especially humans who have experts who have been in the field for a while and have that experience. There is still a gap between that and what you can get sort of out of the box from an LLM based agent today. So I think there is still that gap. So the question is really, yes, you can start bridging that gap, but until then, you're still talking augmentation in terms of humans plus AI. The other piece is that, a lot of industries are also regulated high stakes industries where your decisions have a lot of repercussions. There's also liability associated with the actions that you take. So at the end of the day, you still have to put down responsibility to say, even if it's an agentic system that's taking the action, who is ultimately responsible for the consequences of that action, and who's going to take the accountability for that. So all of these things are still being resolved. So I mean, it's easy to say automation for some of the very simple routine things, but I think if you really look at the industry as a whole, I don't think it is. It's still, you're still talking augmentation and humans working in concert with AI.
And I think this specifically is really close to my heart because the reason why I started Wise and AI, which is my startup, was because I noticed my grandparents and a lot of older adults in general have decades of knowledge that's basically being lost or unused because the technology doesn't meet them halfway. And so the idea of hybrid intelligence is basically the same idea, except on a different demographic. So I have to ask you, when you design a system where a human and an agent are working together, what is a single hardest design question?
Communication. I think if you think about the human plus AI system as sort of a collaborative multi-agent system, right? So there are some things that the human knows, and there are some things that the AI knows, the AI or the agent, that agent knows, and they also have different sets of capabilities. I think the biggest issue is actually how do you ensure that the human is able to understand what the AI system is doing. And actually now increasingly with the way agentic systems are developing and the power of what they can do, it is really ensuring that you do not kind of cognitively overload the human. So to give you an example, you can have deep research agents now that can produce like a 50-page paper. Okay. So it can be a 50-page analyst report that is quite comparable. But the issue is, how is a human going to check this 50-page report, right? And how much time and effort does it take for the human to check this 50-page report? And if at some point the risk is that they don't actually check it because there is so much, right? And you see a similar thing with all the coding assistants now, that they can generate code so quickly, but the human ability to review and check and make sure that this is correct and you don't have any other inadvertent like mistakes or leakage or anything of that sort is kind of lagging the the rate at which coding agents can generate tokens. So I think that's the first kind of actually design challenge is how do you make sure that that communication channel is structured in a way that humans can actually assess without being overloaded. And because a lot of systems are also being built on the premise that humans are able to check these things, right? You hope that somehow the human is able to check this output, but that's not a given unless you actually design for that. I would say the other direction is also important. So it is the human understanding what the AI is doing, but the AI also being able to learn from the humans. So Satvik, going back to what you were saying, that the humans have a lot of knowledge accumulated from years of experience. And the design of the channel in the other direction is also really important because that's how your agent can hopefully learn from the human over time and get better, right? So it's like taking your agent when it starts out is like an intern on the desk or a first year analyst, right? And you have to set them up in a way that they can interact and learn from the human. So chat is as a design paradigm is good in the sense that it is very open ended, but people are also starting to explore other types of feedback mechanisms to design that channel.
And so, specifically inside JP Morgan, who is the agent for today? Is it like the trader? Is it the analyst, the compliance team? Where exactly is the agent showing up first?
I think in many different places. I think by and large, I would say for internally for employees to be able to be more productive in their tasks, whether it's covering clients or providing investment advice or on the operations and compliance side. But it's the first places they're showing up is internally as assistants to employees in their day-to-day jobs.
And just one more question on this. What is the open research problem in agentic AI that, if you solved it tomorrow, would change the most about finance?
For finance specifically, I would say controlled autonomy because I think the issue is that yes, you have generalist agents like Claude Code that are very powerful now, but within an industry like finance, you actually need a very high degree of reliability at execution time. And you need the agent to actually respect regulations and policies and constraints. So if you think of Claude Code as a highly autonomous agent, the challenge is really how do you control that autonomy in a way that you give the agent high degrees of autonomy in certain points, but at certain points it's almost you're guaranteed that it will respect constraints. So which are things like regulations and policies. So I think that is, or for instance, handling highly sensitive data in ways that are completely reliable and guaranteed. So I think that machinery is very, I would say, ad hoc right now. A lot of work is being done, uh, both in academia and in industry, but it is not yet, say, for instance, at the level of sophistication or of understanding as a typical control system. Right. So if you have a control system that's flying a plane, engineers understand very well how that works and what the parameters are and what the boundaries are for that system. We don't have that same level of control and understanding for these systems yet, which means that you have to be highly cautious in how you are rolling them out. So I think if that changes, that's a big step change in terms of how quickly it can be rolled out.
Okay, so I just want to switch gears to how the work actually happens. So when your team starts a new project, what exactly comes first? Is it a problem that the actual business hands you, or is it a paper that you've read, or is it just a hunch?
Uh, I think we inhabit both worlds. So we work very closely with businesses. We also, publish, go to conferences. So we're very much involved on the in the research community as well. But I would say I think the most impactful, if I look back, the most impactful papers and the most impactful work that we have done is really been driven through business problems, because it's not necessarily solving that specific business problem. People will come to us and describe to us, obviously not in the language of research or not even in the language of AI, what they want done. But most often, those problems, if you start abstracting it out technically, are more complex than anything that you would see in academic benchmarks. So it often gives us like actually very hard problems to work on. And many of those, I think, have resulted in some of the best, both the best products we've built as well as the best papers that we have written. For example, there's a system we built that has been used for a couple of years now for resource allocation, and that also was one of the top 4% papers at TMLR and presented at iClear. But the whole idea for that paper really came because of this question of how do you incentivize people to truthfully reveal their demand when you don't have a price, when you have a resource allocation setting where you don't have a price. So if I tell you, Satvik, you can put in whatever demand you want, and I'm doing an allocation and you don't really have to pay for it, what is there to incentivize you to truthfully tell me that I want 10 units of this and not 100, right? So it's a well-known problem in game theory and economics, but it's yeah, it's things like that. You run into problems which are in business settings that I think have led us to very interesting parts of exploration on the research side.
So, what exactly is the difference with all your experience, right, between doing AI research at a university like Berkeley versus inside a bank like JP Morgan? And obviously not just like the salary, but the actual like day-to-day science. What is the difference?
I think it is more challenging to do research in a in an industry setting. I think there are two ways in which I see it as, like, there are two ways in which you validate new methodologies and algorithms and things you come up with, right? Like, one is the publication process, which you go through a peer review, and that's one validation process. Another process is actually mm, having it be used by people in actual applications, right? So it's like OpenAI now, when it releases something new, they don't really need to publish a paper because, like, millions of people are using their product, right? So you have to validate the progress that you're making one way or the other. I think the good thing is it gives you both avenues, but it is often the second, in terms of having something be implemented in a way that is actually useful and moves the needle, is often a higher bar, I think, to meet. Because on a paper you can show, like, hey, this is great, it shows like a 5 percentage point improvement, but in a real system, by the time you actually get down to implementing it and making some optimizations, like, you find out that 5% really is meaningless. It doesn't really kind of shift outcomes significantly. So I think it is much more challenging. I enjoy it more, partly because it I like that challenge of making things work in actual systems.
Nice. And I also do want to ask about reinforcement learning debugging. So when you have a multi-agent simulation and it produces a weird result, how do you tell the difference between a bug and an actual insight?
Yeah, you should always first assume it's a bug, is
Mhm.
is like the standard advice. As I mentioned before, multi-agent learning in particular is quite hard, even often, to stabilize in meaningful ways. And so I think, in a lot of, and this is both, I would say this both for reinforcement learning, but also for most other work that we do. My advice to people is always kind of make sure that you are setting up a set of diagnostic tests. So you should know, sort of like, you should have a good enough understanding of the problem and design your experiments with the objective that you're going to test out certain things. it doesn't happen automatically. So just, the most naive thing you can do is say, I set this off, it is training, here's my reward, it goes up like this, great, right? Or your loss function comes down like a great. It doesn't really mean that you have actually achieved the final objectives, right? This is one metric that you're optimizing. So it means that, okay, great, something meaningful has happened. Now you take the trained model and you start running through a set of tests that you have designed to understand the behavior of the agent, test the agent behavior in different settings. So you need to lay out what that experiment plan is from the beginning, so you can actually sanity check any result for any training. This is true even for non-reinforcement learning stuff.
And lastly, about how the research actually gets done. What do you think is one method or tool, and it can be in open source, internal, doesn't really matter, but what is one tool that your team uses today that you wouldn't have predicted 3 years ago?
You said 3 years ago, was that?
Like 3 years, 2 years, something like that.
Okay. Yeah.
I know, like I know how quickly the landscape is changing,
Yeah.
but
I'm just trying
yeah.
to think back, what were we doing 3 years ago? Okay, so that's May 2023. Yeah. So look, I think the tooling, AI is an area where the tooling always gets better. So this is an incredible field, and I love being in this field for this reason. It's not every field that is like this either. But people share stuff, right? Like, so the community puts out like stuff on Hugging Face. People will pre-train models and put out. So it's a very strong ecosystem, and that always gets better. So, with that expected trajectory in mind, I think the surprise has been, if I look back to May 2023, probably things like Claude Code. Because if I look back at that time, we, not so much in terms of the direction, but in terms of the speed with which it has happened. Because I think when we were in May of 2023, we were building systems with language model agents. But at that time, we were still thinking of this is a tool for us to build things for other people, right? We did not anticipate, or at least I would not have predicted that, you know, so quickly in 26, we would be the ones who are also as much consumers of it uh, as the developers of it. So I think that shift has happened faster than I expected.
Yeah, Claude Code is, I mean, I've seen it firsthand. It's, I mean, even within like the past year, it's completely like changed the entire AI landscape. So,
Yeah, it's just like
so
from, I would say, what, fourth quarter of end of last year to like big shift. Yeah.
yeah. And so now, as a founder myself, I just want to put that hat on just for a question, because this obviously is rare access for a high schooler building an AI. So, if you were starting a small AI project from scratch today with limited compute and a small team, what do you think is the playbook? Where exactly would you start?
Is this from a research perspective or from a startup product perspective?
I mean, I know you have a lot of experience in AI research, but just in general, like with all of that experience, just in the field of AI, right? What do you what do you
Yeah.
think?
So I'm asking because I would maybe let me give two slightly different answers from those perspectives. I think if you're as a startup, I would say, it is a difficult field because with every model release, right, the big frontier labs are kind of eating into uh, the space that some of the startups had created as wrappers around models. So that space gets eaten away all the time. So that's something that and it impacts both research and I think startup development, because even for us, when we think about research projects, we're thinking, well, let's think about where the puck is going, right? Like, if we why should we even work on this, or is this something that we think in the next model release this capability is going to be higher performing? And so I think that's, given that landscape, I would say the things that are kind of high potential, if you, because you said like with a smaller team and compute and all of those constraints, I would look at either going deep and niche into verticals where you solve things end to end, right? So you really understand what, a particular vertical end to end and build a solution for it, which is going to be AI plus other things. But it is, I think there is still a lot that needs to be built around any model, even something as good as Claude Code, to really make it performant for a particular application. So if you pick a good application, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. The second is around reliability for agentic systems. So, things like the essentially ensuring security, trustworthiness of AI systems in general, including how they handle private data, all of those things, it's essentially everybody is building agentic systems. If you think about what are the problems around that, around the periphery of that, I think that is also from a startup space, that's an opportunity. From a research angle, I would go in a completely different direction, and which is a little bit long term, which is I think small models, which might be a startup opportunity as well, actually. I think small models are very underrated right now. So it is, I think everybody is on the big model train, but the costs are going to start hitting people pretty hard. And I think the small model space is I would look for opportunities of building small, highly custom models, because I think people are going to soon kind of start making more strategic decisions around the ROI of token cost versus what is what is the actual return for a specific application.
Okay, good advice, but it's cool to see the two different perspectives. And anyways, moving on to the next segment. Since this is a podcast that's called, High School Edition, this is for the high school listeners. Pretty quick, but if the first question would be if you were 16 right now, or any teen, right, sitting in a classroom right now in some high school, and you wanted to do AI research one day, not just using ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, but actually doing research, what is the curriculum? Would you do like the math first? Would you do STEM subjects, or should you code? Would you code first? Would you read papers? Like what do you think is the curriculum?
Uh, There's obviously math, I think, that is, but even as a high schooler, a lot of AI is accessible, even like with calculus, for instance, right? So there are areas of AI that are quite accessible. In terms of subjects, the other things I would study is probability theory and real analysis, that kind of stuff, if you really want to do research, because most research papers require not just system building, but also you need to have sort of theoretical proofs and things like that. So that's from a subject standpoint, that's what I would focus on. But AI has always been the space where it's like always been a mix of computation and math, right? So this is I think there are some of the biggest ideas in the field have not just come from a mathematical perspective. It has come from that intuition that comes from actually building things, doing things, and it's kind of the intuition and the idea leads first, and all the mathematical machinery often comes later, right? So in terms of I think programming computation is a very important perspective to have there, which you can get in many different ways, right? Like by working, I think the best way is by working on projects. It is because it really forces you to think about things from a solution and systems perspective, and learn many things that you might not learn in the course of just doing doing coursework. So I think the best way to learn is actually to find problems that you're really interested in, like, and then start digging into how you would solve them. Even if you don't have you don't know everything you need to solve it at present, I think it still leads you on a very good journey of understanding part of the field well and actually building and developing that intuition and understanding. Reading papers. So you have to understand right now, like this year's NeurIPS, I think, has about 20,000 submissions. So it's just crazy right now in terms of the volume of papers coming out. So what I always caution people against like going into this literature survey mode, because nobody ever comes up with a great idea by doing a literature survey. So I I would say find a problem that you care about first and then start reading and read and think and read and think. Like don't, because if you read too much, then you get kind of anchored. You're in what you have read, and it's very difficult to kind of think of something different or new from a research perspective. So I would always say pick a problem that you care about, start reading, and then read a little bit and then think on your own about how would I solve this problem, and then read some more rather than just go out and say I'm going to read all the papers in a particular area.
Okay. So moving on to the end of this episode, we end every episode with the quick fire segment. So I'm just gonna ask short prompts, and the first thing that comes to mind, just blurt it out, and 60 seconds maximum. So
Mhm.
are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So first off, the paper that most influenced your thinking in the last year.
I think a lot of papers are quite derivative now. I think the one paper that struck me the most recently is I was at MIT and there was a presentation by Dina Katabi where they've been doing work to be able to recognize Parkinson's from breathing signals of patients. And what was
Mm.
really interesting, I thought, about that work was this notion of building neural network foundation models that really map across from observational data like breathing to EEG signals. So it's kind of correlating two very different modalities or observations of one physical phenomenon and building a network that ties these two things together. So I've not done anything with it yet, but I thought it was a super interesting idea.
Yeah, I'll definitely look into it. That sounds interesting. Second question, the most overhyped idea in AI right now.
Transformers.
Okay.
I think it's an overused, I mean, it's a useful architecture. We are kind of exploiting the most out of it. We are wringing the most out of it. But yes, I think it's probably overused at this point.
Mm. And the most underhyped.
I think I mentioned this before. I think small models, the thing that I think about a lot is, the human brain operates on 20 watts, you know, and we are burning up like huge amounts of energy to train models, to even do inference on models. Okay. You could argue that, well, training the human brain is already pre-trained through years of evolution. So not a fair comparison, but even on inference. So I think the landscape in 10 years from now is going to look very different from where we are right now, because the direction of travel in computer science has always been smaller, more efficient, and distributed. And we are at the opposite of all of that right now.
Something you believe about multi-agent systems that most of your peers don't.
Uh, I don't know, you could call it belief or hope, but either way, I believe and hope that multi-agent systems will have, or multi-agent simulations in particular, will have like a Gen AI moment, like an LLM moment, in the sense that it becomes as easy or well understood to train or even kind of in context fine tune learn a new multi-agent simulation very quickly from previous simulations, which it always takes a lot of effort to build one of these to be high fidelity, but I think they can unlock so much in terms of most of the complex questions we ask about our world, like what would happen if the Strait of Hormuz is closed for another month, like important questions like that. I think a lot of those are about simulating different scenarios in very complex systems. So I think it can make, I hope we have a moment like that.
And lastly, the best advice you've ever been given.
to be fully responsible for my own career, to that nobody else is responsible for it. Like you have to take full responsibility and act with high agency.
Yeah, you have to own it.
Yeah.
Okay, so one last question. There's probably some high schooler listening to this right now who has just been told by every single adult in their life that AI is going to take their job, either take their job or save the world. So, what is the one idea that you want that person, that high schooler, to walk away with?
I think AI is going to be a tool. It's going to be like Excel. It's going to be like, in the sense, it's going to be woven into the fabric of things that we do. Yes, I do think a lot of change is coming, but also some of I think what you're seeing right now is a very short term reaction when nobody knows anything, right? So there's a very short term reaction. But I think long term for people of your generation, this is going to be a tool that you're going to shape and use. So I don't believe that, you are going to be used by AI. You are going to use AI.
Thank you so much for your time. This has truly been the conversation that I was hoping it to be. So, thank you so much for, going deep into the research you've done. Thank you so much for taking a high school podcast like this seriously. Thank you so much for showing what real AI research looks like inside like an actual company like JP Morgan.
Thank you. And thank you for such thoughtful questions. They were really in depth questions. So thank you for that, Satvik. Really enjoyed the talk.
3 things I'm going to be thinking about after that conversation. 1. Dr. Ganesh's definition of an agent. Not the buzzword version, the textbook version. Something that takes in observations, has a goal, picks the next action, and learns from what happens. That's it. Every system that calls itself an AI agent should be measured against that definition first. 2. Communication is the hardest design problem in human plus AI work. Not models, not data. Communication. She said a deep research agent can now write you a 50-page report. The question is whether a human can actually check 50 pages. If you're building anything with AI, write on a sticky note. 3. Her closing line. AI is going to be a tool, like Excel. You are going to use it. It is not going to use you. The agency belongs to your generation. Don't give it away. Show notes have links to every paper we discussed in this conversation. There's also a link to her group's open source code. If you're a high schooler building something with AI, send it to me. I read everything. I'm Satvik Subramanian, founder of Wise in AI. This was AI Innovators High School Edition. See you next week.